In this podcast, two Gen Xers are taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting and reflecting on the cinema of the 1980s. We'll look at the hits and the flops, the studio blockbusters and art house indies, the critically acclaimed, and the universally reviled. The series is hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli, a writer and librarian, and features Dustin Morrow, a filmmaker, author, and professor of film. So pull on your legwarmers, crank up your boombox, and hop in the DeLorean. It's time for the long rewind.
Hello and welcome to the long rewind. This is Dustin. With me, as always, is Lisa.
Hey, everybody.
And this is a deep dive into 80s cinema. If you listen to our first episode, I discussed there sort of what the format of this series would be. But I'll just reiterate really quickly, since this is our first sort of year-centric episode, which is going to form the bulk of this series. We're going to look at the 1980s year by year. So we're looking at every film, essentially, that was released in the decade. We're using release date calendars as a guide for us to form the body of films that we're going to be discussing in the show. And what we'll be doing is we'll be splitting each year into 2 episodes because it's just a lot to cover. There was so much interesting work going on in the 80s in film that we didn't want to just do 1 episode per year. So we're covering essentially January to June. And then July to December in a second episode for each of the 10 years that compose the decade. We'll be talking about films that we think were sort of the quintessential 80s cinema that were somehow important to the 1980s or demonstrative of what was going on in the 80s or evidence of the culture of the 1980s. We'll also be talking about what we're going to call like unsung gems, or just films that we really love ourselves that maybe are not necessarily always forgotten. Some of them will be, though, but are films that we think deserve to be sort of heralded as among the better films to come out of the 1980s. We'll have a fun segment, I think, called Rewindable Moments, which is essentially going to be spotlighting certain scenes from films that we found to be particularly wonderful or memorable. We'll also be talking about the box office from that year and the Oscars, sort of measuring whether we think the audiences and the Academy got it right. Lisa's going to start out each episode, though, by just sort of telling us what was going on in that year. So since we're starting with 1980 here, Lisa, why don't you take it away and tell us what was happening in the world in 1980?
Happy to do it. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to kick us off with some 1980 history and events. So first, let's just talk historical events. The 1980 Winter Olympics were held in Lake Placid, New York, and that's where the U.S. ice hockey team famously defeated the Soviet Union in what became known as the Miracle on Ice. And
which became a film called Miracle with Kurt Russell.
Was there more than one movie? There was a lot.
There was also a TV movie, which I think was called Miracle on Ice. And there's a really great HBO documentary. It's only like 45 minutes long called Do You Believe in Miracles, which is really good.
Yeah, so it was a really big deal. No movies about it in 1980, obviously, but it was a big deal later.
I think it's considered by many to be the greatest moment in American sports history.
Yeah.
And sort of the greatest underdog story. I use it when I teach. I've taught a course on sports in film, and I always start with the Miracle on Ice just as a discussion point to talk about what sports can mean culturally.
Yeah, it's huge. Also, an Olympic historical event in 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Summer Olympic Games held in Moscow in protest against the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. So it was kind of a big year for the U.S. and Olympic news. Ronald Reagan was elected as the 40th president of the United States, defeating incumbent President Jimmy Carter in the November presidential election. Obviously, that would go on to have a big impact on the 80s. The assassination of former Beatle John Lennon occurred on December 8th in New York City. Again, pretty huge. The Iranian embassy siege took place in London, where the Iranian terrorists held several hostages.
They were special
Yeah, they were,
hostages
of
too.
course, they were special hostages. Sorry. They held several hostages at the Iranian embassy. The siege was eventually resolved by a British Special Air Service, SAS, operation. And the eruption of Mount St. Helens led to the death of 57 people and caused widespread damage, including the destruction of over 200 homes, bridges, and roads. And in pop culture, specifically, the Rubik's Cube was invented by Hungarian architect Erno Rubik. Disco was declining. It was on life support in 1980. The year saw the rise of new wave and post-punk music, some of Dustin's favorites, with bands like The Police, Blondie, Talking Heads, and Joy Division gaining popularity, some of both of our favorites in there. The rock band AC/DC released their highly successful album Back in Black. John Lennon's final studio album, Double Fantasy, was also released shortly before his assassination. The primetime soap opera Dallas premiered in 1980. Other popular shows of the year included Magnum P.I., MASH, The Love Boat, and Three's Company. Again, some of our favorites in there.
Did you ever watch Dallas?
I was way too young for Dallas generally. I never really watched it, although I've certainly seen clips of it, and I know it was a big influence on the 80s fashion and pop culture otherwise, right? I don't know, did you watch
Well, and it kind of
Dallas?
created the idea of like the season-ending cliffhanger with Who Shot JR.
Yeah,
right?
that's totally a very normal thing
No,
now.
of the shows you mentioned, the one that kind of sticks with me is Magnum P.I., which was an important movie that I remember watching with my dad, and show that I remember watching with my dad, and it was just a show I really loved and still love.
Yeah, good stuff. The arcade game Pac-Man was released in 1980 and became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring various merchandise and spawning numerous sequels and adaptations.
And the song Pac-Man Fever.
The song Pac-Man Fever. Lots of Pac-Man in the 80s. The Walkman, a portable cassette player introduced by Sony, revolutionized the way people listened to music and became a popular accessory. And eventually would spawn, AirPods and listening to music on your iPhone today, basically, right?
Yeah.
Notable events in film and entertainment of 1980. On April 29th, Sir Alfred Hitchcock, known as the Master of Suspense, died at his home in Bel Air, California at the age of 80, a huge loss to cinema, in my opinion. June 9th, Richard Pryor set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine and drinking 151 proof rum. Pryor ran down his street in Northridge, California until subdued by police. Must have been quite a sight.
Yeah, well, that did also give us one of the best concert films of the 80s, which was Richard Pryor Live on the Sunset Strip, where he spends the last third of that movie talking about that event. And it is hilarious.
He was amazing. On November 19th, Heaven's Gate became one of the biggest box office bombs of all time, and its colossal failure bankrupted United Artists. Is that still one of the biggest box office bombs?
Yeah,
Heaven's
I think
Gate?
when you sort of adjust for inflation, yeah, it's famous as Blank's Gate is still used
Right.
as a shorthand for a flop or
For a turkey, basically.
it's certainly
Yeah.
I always think of it kind of as a 70s movie because it was very much a sort of Michael Cimino directed it. It's a very kind of laconic 70s attitude sort of Western, like the bombs from the 80s that spring to my mind when I think like true bombs of the 80s, like famous ones are Howard the Duck and Ishtar, right?
Right.
But yeah, Heaven's Gate technically was in the 80s. It came out in 1980.
I was just curious, with all the films that have come out since then with their enormous budgets, I wondered if anything had topped it in terms of a bomb.
I'm sure there have. John Carter from Disney. There have been a lot of there have been a ton that have just lost insane amounts of money.
Right. And that, I just want to point out, that's an interesting thing to remember about 1980 as we talk about it, that a lot of things do still feel kind of 70s, because when you change decade, it doesn't just, completely change. A lot of things from the 70s will be carrying over into the early 80s for sure.
Oh, yeah. Disco was still hanging around. There's a lot of cultural Freaks and Geeks. The show Freaks and Geeks was really great at capturing that very specific moment where the 70s turned into the 80s.
Yeah, definitely. Just some general film things that were happening at the time. Industry professionals predicted comedy films and upbeat entertainment to dominate theaters in 1980. This was a response to poor morale in a nation suffering through economic recession, which generally increased theatrical visits as audiences sought escapism and ignored romantic films and depictions of blue-collar life, so people were looking for a laugh. The average cost of making films had risen to $6 million, which had reduced the number of films being made for niche audiences.
Yeah, that's part of that whole Reagan thing, right? Morning in America. That was Reagan's big thing. It was like a new sense of optimism. And it was backed by obviously the fact that the economy was roaring in the 80s for the most part.
Yeah.
And what we'll talk a lot about this as we go through all these years, but it was an era of excess and sort of hedonism, I guess. Like good times. People tend to look at the 80s very fondly now, even though there was a lot of pain and a lot of horrible things happened in the 80s.
Sure.
And certainly Reagan was hugely responsible for a lot of those things. But it's generally sort of remembered affectionately, right? As a decade of fun.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, heck, we're
bright
devoting
colors and pop music
right.
and big blockbuster movies, which you kind of alluded to at the end.
Yep.
The fact that we're making fewer indie films. It wasn't there were some great indie movies, and we'll talk about them as we go through these years, but it's not an era that's remembered necessarily for being a great, the 90s is considered a great indie cinema decade, and the 70s certainly is too, but the 80s is the era of the blockbuster. And
right.
And part of it is just the studios coming out of the 70s seeing really big hits and realizing that they could make fewer movies and just invest more money in those movies to go for bigger pieces of box office rather than spreading it amongst other films. But that's even more true today.
I was going to say, sounds a little familiar, perhaps.
Oh, yeah. I don't know about you, but when I first sat down to look at the calendars of release dates of all the movies that came out in the 80s, I was sort of amazed at how many movies came out on each weekend. Like each movie had a good 5 or 6 big studio movies coming out, and that doesn't happen nowadays. Now it's like maybe 2 tops will come out on a weekend, and studios are just not interested in trying new original ideas. We're stuck in a cycle of superhero movies.
So it sounds like some of that, we're seeing a return to what was happening in the 80s here. And as well as, again, I'm just thinking again of how 1980 maybe still was a little bit in the 70s in the sense that change was only just starting to happen, which is kind of interesting. Just one more thing about sort of the milieu of film at this time, a surge of interest in science fiction following Star Wars release in the late 70s led to many small and big budget entries into that sci-fi genre, which I'm sure we'll be talking about and seeing as we progress through the decade.
Yeah, so. I think we should probably do a whole episode just on sci-fi and fantasy in the 80s, because I think it's the true golden era, especially for fantasy filmmaking. Yeah. I don't think was a better decade in cinema history for fantasy filmmaking than the 1980s.
You had focuses on subgenres of fantasy. It wasn't just fantasy. There were different kinds. It was just a huge explosion of sci-fi and fantasy in the 80s, more than anyone had seen, I think, in film to date. So,
So should we talk about what do we think the quintessential films of 1980 were?
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear
I have
your
8.
list. Yeah, I probably have something similar, maybe even more.
I'll start by just mentioning the I like all of these films except for one, and so I'll start with that one. And I think it's Friday the 13th.
Okay.
Which Halloween is often credited with launching the slasher genre.
Yeah.
But I think Friday the 13th is just as responsible, if not more responsible for that, because it was the first sort of really successful Halloween ripoff. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think the studios were like, oh, so you can successfully rip that movie off and for $5 and make a ton of money.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
The Halloween may have put the idea in everybody's head, but Friday the 13th kind of opened the floodgates.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So,
Kevin Bacon's in it. That's
oh, is
one
he
of the few
really?
things. He gets an arrow through the throat in
Oh,
a scene, and it has
yeah.
it does have a legitimately interesting twist as to who the killer is at the end of the movie.
Hmm.
But there's not really much else to recommend it. It's the Friday the 13th franchise is generally, I think, like the worst of the slasher franchises.
If I may say something, yeah, I put that on my list too because it seems so influential. But I've never seen it, and I've never seen a Jason movie. I was very afraid of like all slasher movies, and I'm still not the biggest
You
fan of
wouldn't like
slasher
them, and they're
movies.
not worth your time to be
Yeah.
honest. There's not enough art in them.
Uh huh.
Like I would
Uh huh.
argue that there's reason to watch some of the Nightmare on Elm
Mm-hmm.
Streets because
Yeah.
there's some actual imaginative work going on in them,
Yeah.
but not in Friday the
Yeah.
13th. They're pretty much all bad.
I was going to ask you that. I mean, I'm sure we'll be talking about the Freddy movies later.
Yeah.
I actually finally did, as under your tutelage, bring myself to watch the first.
And you thought it was okay.
I did. I actually liked it. I thought, like you're saying, I thought there was a lot of really interesting, cool imagery in it. So I actually did like that. I was too afraid to watch it when it came out, but anyway, I was just curious. So that came later. Nightmare on Elm Street stuff all came
I
after
want to say
Jason.
Elm Street was 84.
Okay, so quite a bit later.
There were a ton
Yeah,
in between.
that's so
There were
interesting.
Hell Night, and there were just like Terror Train. Jamie Lee Curtis alone was like a mini franchise unto herself. She
Hence
made
the
a
Scream
ton of these
Queen title.
slasher movies,
Yeah.
most of which were pretty bad. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
What else did you have among the your quintessential 1980 movies?
Oh, well, I kind of want to hear your list, but I had Friday the 13th also. I put a lot here that I haven't seen, but I know is
They're just important.
notable or important. I had
Yeah.
Cruising, which I've never
Mhm.
seen, but I understand is kind of a big deal, or I don't
Yeah,
know.
I had that on my unsung gems list.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't a hit at the time. I don't think it made
Right.
much of a splash at the time. It's a William Friedkin thriller starring Al Pacino as
Right.
a police officer who goes undercover in the kind of S&M gay club bondage
Mhm.
scene to find a serial killer who's been killing gay men.
Right.
And he's a straight guy, and sort of goes undercover in this, and is shocked by what he sees. It was an era where you could culturally, I guess, be shocked by such a thing. Reagan was president. It was a very conservative
Yeah.
era.
Oh, yeah.
It's a pretty daring movie, and it's a pretty it has a frustrating ending, but it's William Friedkin. It's a really good movie. It's a solid thriller. It has a truly bizarre moment of interrogation that I won't spoil, but people have seen it and know exactly what I'm talking about, and they're laughing. It was one of my rewindable moments, actually.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a scene where Pacino first goes to this pretty rough gay club and starts dancing with another guy, and it's his first time that he's ever done this. And you can see him sort of start to get into it, start to enjoy it, and it's all played on his face from in a long shot, and it's just a really good piece of acting and filmmaking. And then it kind of morphs into just a really odd, memorable scene because Pacino's dancing is really spasmodic and strange.
Uh-huh.
It's not something you'll easily forget once seen.
Interesting. I just want to mention, so we will be talking about later some rewindable moments, some things that we think are worth like revisiting in some of
Yep.
these movies. And maybe tell the folks, I don't know if you mentioned who William Friedkin is or why he's important, because I don't actually really know.
Yeah. He kind of his first big success, I think, was The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
Or no, that's not true because I think The French Connection came first. He's just one of those,
Yeah.
quintessential New York filmmakers of the 1970s.
Well, those are two really notable
he was
movies,
in that
right?
group of
Yeah.
like
Okay.
amazing, like Scorsese and De Palma, and
Okay.
he made those were his big hits from from the 70s. He made a movie that I really love and that a lot of people who are hardcore cineasts love, called Sorcerer, which is a remake of The
Oh,
Wages of Fear.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, yeah.
about a group of guys that have to drive a truck full of explosives through the Amazon.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most suspenseful movies you'll ever see. It's just a 2 hour
Mhm.
knot in your stomach as these guys try not to blow up as they drive these rickety old trucks full of dynamite across these incredibly horrible roads and bridges and stuff.
Kind of an amazing premise,
Yeah.
frankly. Doesn't get much more suspenseful than that. Do you wanna give us another of your,
Yeah, I'll give you a couple quick ones.
Yeah.
Just in the interest of speeding us along, some of the ones that I think are obvious that you probably had
Yep.
too. Empire Strikes Back,
Yep, absolutely.
which sort of, was a like Star Wars, was a leap forward in visual effects, and was one of the first big kind of franchise movies of the 80s and one of the first big sequels of the 80s, and really demonstrated to Hollywood that there was massive amounts of money to be made in making your film into a trilogy or a franchise of some kind, and sequelizing the hell out of it. The Blues Brothers,
Mhm.
which was the first Saturday Night Live movie, first movie based on
Oh,
SNL
yeah.
characters, and was very successful. And so, of course, we got a million others. It's also made by a director I really love named John Landis,
Oh, yeah.
who
Wonderful.
is kind of like the king of excess and sort of like, I'm going to say, wasting money in filmmaking. And that movie is probably the most demonstrative movie of that, because it's just full of like, I mean, the car chase alone in the
Yeah.
third act is one of the most ridiculous uses of a studio's money that you'll ever see.
Yeah, I don't think you'll see more car chase madness or mayhem, like, maybe even in a Fast and the Furious movie, certainly not practically. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it's
something.
it's a truly wild scene. You can't,
Yeah.
because you do know it's all happening for real, and
Yeah.
it's wild.
It's really
I had
wild.
The Shining,
Yep,
Kubrick's masterpiece, which
of
Stephen King
course.
famously hated.
Mhm.
Um, and I will say that I understand Stephen King's criticism of it, and I totally agree with it. But I think the movie is so amazing that you can't deny what it is. Um,
Yeah, it's an
but for
amazing
those of you
movie.
that don't know, the thing Stephen King hates about Kubrick's movie is that um, the movie essentially starts with Jack Nicholson seeming like he's already crazy. And so he has sort of nowhere to go over the course of the
Mm,
movie. Like he goes from being
interesting.
crazy to being crazier. And in the book, um, that character is essentially a sane person at the beginning of the
Right.
book, and he is driven
It's all
to
about the
insanity
evolution.
by
Yeah.
and he's not wrong. But the movie is just such a formalist masterpiece. It's such an interesting film that I think you can't deny its
Yeah.
greatness.
I mean, it can stand on its own. It's almost maybe like they're two different pieces of art, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of those movies that can still scare you or give you scary imagery as an adult that, you'll watch horror movies sometimes or scary movies as an adult and they're really not that scary. But to me, The Shining is still pretty scary,
Yeah,
at least for me. I don't know. I scare kind
yeah,
of
it's
easy, but
scariest to me, not in the like traditionally
jump
scary
scare.
scenes where
Yeah.
he's chasing the kid through
Uh-huh.
the snow at the end,
Yeah.
but like the moments of just incredible weirdness, like the guy in I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a gorilla outfit who's
Oh.
you know delivering oral sex to like an old man, like, and
Oh,
the
good Lord. I
lady
don't
in
remember
the old
that.
lady in the
Okay. Yeah.
bathtub. They're
Yeah.
just
All
these
right.
like
Right.
incredibly weird, strange, out of nowhere images
Very,
that are
very
just really unsettling
disturbing.
and
Yeah.
unexplainable.
Yeah, that's true.
I had American Gigolo,
Mhm.
is a
Yep.
movie that really launched Richard Gere into fame,
Yep.
and it's a Paul Schrader movie about a Hollywood gigolo who is accused of murder and it has to get himself out of this sort of jam that he's in, and it's a it's a neo noir, and it's one of the
Mm.
earliest neo noirs in a decade that did that genre really
Yeah, that's
well. Like
true.
I'm sure we'll
Mhm.
talk about Body Heat and some of the other
Yep,
great
of
neo
course.
noirs of that era. But American Gigolo was probably the first one to come out in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Paul Schrader movie. And it's also just very 80s. It uses Blondie's Call Me
Yeah, I was
as
gonna
the
say that.
basis of its score.
Mm-hmm.
You just hear that song basically through the whole movie. It just can't get more 80s than Richard Gere driving through
Yeah. I'm a little,
LA in
yeah.
a convertible. It's also famous for being one of the first big Hollywood movies to feature male frontal nudity and to
Whoa.
have a
Okay.
major star doing it.
Did he actually do it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can
That's
see little Richard Gere in
Lil Gear.
American Gigolo.
Yeah, that's actually a movie I haven't seen, and I'm a little surprised I haven't. Just not because of that, but because it's a neo noir and because of Blondie. I mean, those are two things I love.
Yeah, it's okay. It's slow. It's not
Mhm.
as good as Body Heat or many of the other
Right.
movies in that genre
Right.
that came out in that era. But it's interesting and it's just extremely,
Yeah.
which is saying something because, as you noted, this is very early in the
Yeah.
80s, but this
Yeah.
movie feels really 80s.
Yeah. Yeah. I had that on my list too, even though I haven't seen it. I know it's kind of influential.
Yeah,
So.
I had Dressed to Kill
Mm-hmm.
mostly
Me
just
too.
because I love it.
Yeah.
It's Brian De
a good movie.
Palma. It's made in the sort of in the middle of the trilogy of my favorite Brian De Palma movies, which
Mhm.
started with Blowout and ended with Body Double, which is the trilogy where he just went hardcore into the Hitchcock homage or
Mhm.
ripoff, depending on what you think of Brian De Palma.
Yeah.
But Dressed to Kill is his Psycho / Vertigo mashup,
Right.
and
Right.
it has another one of my rewindable moments, which is this amazing kind of hypnotic sequence where Angie Dickinson's being followed around the Philadelphia Museum
Oh,
of Art
yeah.
by this
Yeah.
strange man, and she
It's a
becomes
really
kind
good
of
scene.
interested in him, and
Mhm.
it all kind of climaxes in the back of a taxi outside of the museum, and it's just
Yeah.
it's a long wordless
Mhm.
sequence, like 14 minutes or something like that.
Oh,
And
wow. That is long.
De Palma specialized in those. There's another great one in Body Double, like somebody following someone.
Mhm.
They're just amazing scenes.
He's a seriously stylish filmmaker.
Yeah.
No
What else did
kidding.
you have?
Actually, that's the only one I had beyond that. I had two other than those. I debated on putting this one in there, but I think it's kind of influential. Coal Miner's Daughter.
Mhm.
I don't know how many of those kind of movies were put out, that sort of biopic thing before then. I mean, I just don't know. Maybe you know better, but it's a movie I knew about. I haven't seen it, but it's a movie I knew about and thought might be kind of influential.
It was a very successful one. It made a lot
Yeah.
of money, and she won the Oscar for it.
Sissy Space. Is
Uh-huh.
it Sissy
Sissy
Spacek?
Spacek. It's a
Yeah.
biopic of Loretta Lynn.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
And her husband is played by Tommy Lee Jones, kind of an
Oh,
early
interesting.
star-making part for him.
Okay. I mean, and that's so what's interesting about that. It's about Loretta Lynn, and the other movie I had that similar vein, kind of urban cowboy. So that whole 1980s pop country crossover thing, I think it's reflected a little in those two movies. So
Yeah,
I had
I
Urban
had that
Cowboy
too,
as well.
and you know how I love Urban
You
Cowboy.
love Urban Cowboy, yeah.
Urban
It's
Cowboy is
good.
so
It's
great.
really good.
It's just
Yeah.
such a it's a subculture that I didn't even know kind of existed. It's
Yeah.
just one of those things that I think film does better than almost any other medium, which is just it's the ability to be fully immersed in some
Mhm.
culture that you didn't even know is out there. And that whole movie is almost the entire movie is set inside
Yeah.
this honky tonk
Yeah.
club.
Pretty much.
And it's it's so shallow in some ways, but it's just so delightful. It's often called like the country Saturday Night Fever,
Yeah.
which is not
John
entirely
Travolta's in it.
inaccurate.
Yeah.
But yeah, it also started a fun trend of like, it just shows you how likable Travolta is and how amazing a movie star he was in his early career because he's such a jerk.
Oh my gosh, he's such
in
a
it.
jerk in that movie.
And like,
yeah.
we-
I mean, Deborah
and you
Winger's
see
not
that
that great.
and you
She's
see that a
kinda
bunch
bad
in
too.
that era, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
Staying
you
Alive.
do. Mm-hmm.
He's such a prick in Staying Alive.
Yep.
but it's so
Yeah.
fun and you can't hate him. Like you just
Yeah.
can't hate him.
No, it's the true power of the star, right? It's kind
and
of
he's
amazing.
so
Yeah.
wildly out of place in Urban Cowboy because he's
That's
got a New
true.
York accent and he's playing this guy from
It's
West
Barbarino
Texas.
playing a cowboy.
Yeah,
It's kind of wild.
and yet
Yeah.
somehow it's like through the magnitude of his smile, he
Yeah,
sells you.
he
Like
totally
it's just
sells it.
it's just
Mhm.
incredible. That actually had another one of my rewindable moments. In
Oh,
fact,
of
which
course, that
is
makes sense.
there's
Yeah.
a scene where Deborah Winger rides the bull,
Oh,
the
yeah.
mechanical bull.
Yeah.
And she's doing it. She's been told not to do it by Travolta, who's kind of a misogynist. And she's doing it to defy him. And it's
Yep.
after they've split up. And she's also trying to seduce the villain, which is Scott Glenn,
Oh,
at the same
yeah.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the sexiest things not you, but one of the sexiest things that
Yeah. I
a
can
straight
admit
guy
that
will see in any
it's
movie
very
from the
evocative.
80s.
Yeah.
It's just
Mhm.
a phenomenal scene, just the
Yeah.
way she rides the stuff she does on this bull.
It's a well done scene.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Great soundtrack too. I mean, again, it's just something to remind us about the 80s is there was this really big trend of country as pop music
Yeah.
in a way. I remember it from being a kid. That was a
Yeah,
big
well,
deal.
Urban Cowboy kind of launched that. It
Yeah.
was based on
Mhm.
a magazine article, a very successful magazine article for like, I want to say GQ, but one of those sort of magazines,
Mhm.
Vanity Fair maybe. Um, but the movie came out and that soundtrack was a huge hit and kind of like, it started, like you said, that kind of pop country,
Yeah.
that era where Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers both got really pop.
Yeah. I used to see them on TV all the time. I'm sure you did
Yeah,
too.
they would
So
be
many
on shows like
specials that-
Solid Gold, like
Yeah.
shows that you wouldn't expect country artists to show up
Right.
on.
But they'd also have specials of their own on network TV and the Barbara Mandrell show. I used to watch that all the time.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
dating myself. But
Did you have anything else?
that was it for my list.
The only other one I had is kind of a trio because I put them all together because I think they kind of do the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is the movie Foxes, an
Oh,
Adrian
yeah.
Lyne movie,
Uh-huh.
and the movie Little Darlings, and the movie Fame,
Yeah.
which I think are three kind of I don't know if sedate's the right word, but serious movies about young people and the problems they were facing, and they're films that really take the problems of young people seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not like, I mean, certainly the 80s had many juvenile adolescent comedies. Porky's made sure of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those movies.
Uh-huh.
Most of them were horrible. A few of them were decent, but these were not that. And Little Darlings is a movie where Tatum O'Neal and Christy McNichol go to summer camp, and they have this contest to see who can lose their virginity first, which actually sounds like it's the plot of a adolescent sex comedy, but it's not at all what it is. It ends up being this very tender, very mature movie about growing up and losing your innocence and that sort of thing.
Sounds like a Judy Blume book almost to me.
It is. It's it's exactly like that. Yeah. It feels like a Judy Blume book.
It's not one I've seen. I know you really like it, though.
Yeah, Foxes is a movie directed by Adrian Lyne with Jodie Foster, a teenage Jodie Foster, and Sherry Curry from the Runaways, who really could have had a career as an actor if she had, I don't know why she didn't. She's great in it, and it's set in Hollywood, and it's about teenagers that are growing up too fast, and who are sort of more mature than their parents in many cases, and just navigating the problems of that happening, of growing up too fast in a city like Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And of course, Fame, which I think everybody remembers, but maybe if you haven't seen it in a while and then you watch it again, you might be surprised by how serious that movie is.
Well, for me, that
and
was
dark.
a big surprise because I was a huge fan of the television show when I was little. That was like my favorite show of all time. And that show is pretty light, of course. I mean, it was a network show. So when I, as an adult, saw Fame, I was like, whoa, it's been a while since I've seen it. So you may want to tell folks more about it. But yeah, that's...
it's pretty grim. I mean, if you don't remember it, it's a musical about teenagers at the performing arts high school.
Yeah, the LaGuardia High
York.
School, the performing arts. And
and it's often remembered for a really great scene where they kind of spill out into the street and sing the Irene Cara song Fame.
It's wonderful. Yeah. It's so great.
Yeah. And I think or like the Hot Lunch Jam scene, which is a similar scene. It's set in a lunchroom where the whole school is kind of dancing and singing together. And those are very ebullient, fun scenes. And so if that's what you remember about it, you might have this kind of idea in your head that it's this like frothy teen musical, but it's really not, because it really it deals much more with sort of like the danger of maybe chasing your dreams and
Yeah.
how that can result in not just disappointment, but like
And how you can
disillusionment
getting
and
taken advantage of.
yeah,
I mean,
getting
it's one of the things I
yeah,
remember the most
yeah,
about that
yeah.
movie. Pretty grim.
So, what were your uncut gems? Uncut gems, unsung gems. What are
Unsung
the movies
gems.
that you would
I'm mixing
recommend that maybe
metaphors.
aren't going to make a important movie list?
Well, I did put Fame on there, although I don't think it's really unsung. You had it on your other list.
No, I think it's a
I
very
think it straddles
I
a
think it
little.
has its. I think it's celebrated.
Yeah, that's true. And again, I think I'm more of a fan of the TV show than the movie just because I remember it better, but I love it.
Yeah.
I had The Fog, which
me
is a
too.
movie. I just love that
Yep.
movie.
John Carpenter. Yeah, Ghost Story.
Yeah.
The movie he made after Halloween, and it's just a masterpiece of mood.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I want to live in that town, and just picture us doing this podcast from that amazing lighthouse radio station, because that's what we wish we were doing right now, living in that lighthouse in the fog.
It's a great movie. It's one of the
Yeah.
great horror movies of the 80s, for sure.
So cool. I love that. Stunt Rock was another one of my films, and I don't know, a lot of people probably don't know about
Well,
that
tell them what it
film.
is.
Oh gosh, I'm not sure how good I'm going to be at this, but it's well, it's a film by Brian Trenchard Smith, and he's a celebrated Australian filmmaker.
Well, he's British. He did all his work in
Oh, I thought he was Australian.
all of his famous work in the 70s in exploitation cinema he did in
Australia. I thought maybe he was an Australian citizen, but
no,
apparently
he's from,
not now.
From Great Britain.
Okay, British filmmaker who made many of the most amazing and celebrated Australian exploitation films. Ozploitation. And it's about essentially a stunt man who goes to LA to do a job, and he kind of gets mixed up with this rock group. And I mean,
you're making it sound like it has a narrative. So
I'm trying.
So yeah. So Brian famously or infamously was taking a shower one day and had this thought: people really like stunts, and people also really like rock music.
I mean,
what if I put them together in a movie? And Stunt Rock was born, and it's basically it cuts back and forth between these these amazing stunt sequences and this truly bananas rock concert performance by a band called,
I think it's
Sorcery.
Sorcery, I'm thinking of the movie. Sorcery.
Which is a band that has as part of the band a man in a wizard costume and a man in a demon costume, and they do battle. With fire
pyrotechnics
and swords and magic tricks during the show. It is. It's a wild movie. It's hard to describe unless you've actually seen it.
If you're listening to this podcast, you need to go watch it. Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, I do wonder what you think about this as a music video guy. I mean, it has a music video quality to it a little bit, in the sense that, you're seeing all these stunt montages to music. I think the story behind the band is, didn't they almost had Kiss for this
and that's
movie.
I mean, it wouldn't be a cult classic.
It would not. It would have been.
It would be like an actual classic. Like the fact that it's Sorcery is what makes it a cult classic.
Yeah.
If it would have been Kiss, everyone would know about.
Everyone would know about Stunt Rock.
Yeah. So it's a bummer that they didn't end up getting Kiss. But
I forget why it fell through, but
the weirdness of this band Sorcery is part of the charm of the film.
Oh, totally charming.
So, if it had been Kiss, they might have been too big for the movie, if that makes sense. I think they might have it would have felt like a Kiss concert movie during which there were also some stunts happening.
Right. So the stuntman is famous Australian stuntman Grant Page. Right? And he was in all of Brian Trenchard Smith's movies, among many other Australian?
Yeah, Brian managed him. That was one of his.
Okay.
He also did that in addition to directing films.
He's a pretty fearless man and does some pretty crazy things in the movie. Brian's wife is a main actor in this movie. It's just so much fun. We've seen this movie many times. I can recommend it. I think it's super fun.
It's a fun one to see with an audience if you ever get the opportunity to see it in a a revival screening. go see it with a crowd because it's a party movie. It's a fun movie to see with a crowd.
And something I thought about with stunt rock too, was there kind of a stuntman thing going on in the 80s, like a fascination with that? Because I mean, I don't know when The Fall Guy, the TV show, came out, but that was
like 83.
That was like about a stunt guy.
Yep.
And then I don't know this movie, but I saw a movie on our calendar list called The Stunt Man that came out at the very end of that first half of 1980. I don't know what it's about.
It's a weird Peter O'Toole drama, but yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'm calling that out as a potential sub theme of 80s pop culture.
There was a theory. I mean, there were all these like TV specials that were about like stunts and
Evel Knievel was big in the 80s.
Like Dar Robinson was a big name, and Hal Needham, who was a big stuntman, went on to become a big director in that era. He did Smokey and the Bandit and Rad and a bunch of other movies.
Rad.
Yeah, it was long before Tom Cruise was jumping off of mountains. The 80s had an interesting fascination with stunts.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a pre-CGI era. Yeah. So if you saw something amazing in a film, by all accounts, it probably actually happened. Yes. And that was what made those Australian movies that we were just talking about.
Oh my gosh.
So insane. They
would do all this stuff.
Yeah, it's like a subgenre of exploitation movies called Ozploitation, as in OZ, as in Australia. And the most famous one, obviously, is Mad Max and Road Warrior.
Yeah.
But there were just dozens of them, and they were all made in the outback, and they're just full of these like suicidal stuntmen who do the most insane things you've ever seen done on film. Like, you just can't believe people lived through these movies.
Truly.
Yeah.
So Stunt Rock would be a good intro to that if you're interested. I had one more film. You can probably guess what it is.
No, what is it?
Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown.
Yeah, I love Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown.
I love it so much. I remember watching it on TV. I don't know. I mean, obviously, it must have come out in theaters. I remember seeing it on TV, and it was where I learned the word chateau because they go to France in that movie.
Charlie Brown and Linus and Snoopy go to France.
Yeah,
it's adorable. I mean, those early Peanuts movies. Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown, where they're in like a raft race on a river.
Yeah,
is a great one, and they were. So I loved Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown. When I was a kid,
I just had to give it a shout out because it's I don't know.
Yeah,
perhaps a hidden gem. And
I had those too. So. The only ones I would mention are Terror Train, which is actually one of the better slasher movies.
I had heard of it, but I don't know enough about it to comment.
Believe it or not, there's another kind of subgenre of exploitation called Canucksploitation.
Oh, right.
Which is Canadian tax shelter movies.
That's
you could go and make these movies, and Hollywood could go and make these movies in Canada and basically hide them in their taxes. And so there were like dozens and dozens of these cheap Canadian exploitation movies, of which Terror Train was one. It's one with Jamie Lee, and has a truly great twist at the end. And it's just a lot of fun. It's set entirely on a train, obviously. And
is this the one with a magician?
Yep, David Copperfield plays himself in it.
Oh wow!
Before he was famous. Yeah.
How have I not seen this? I've heard you talk about it, and I
I'll have to show it to you if you haven't seen it, because it's a lot of fun.
David
Copperfield.
And the
other movie I would mention
everyone.
is a movie called Hero at Large, which I just think is a kind of an adorable and sweet movie with John Ritter as a out-of-work actor who takes a job promoting a superhero movie by dressing up as the superhero to hand out flyers. And on the way home from that gig, he goes into a convenience mart. This is in Manhattan. And there's a robbery there, and he foils it and then leaves. And the city thinks that there's an actual superhero out there. And he feels this kind of obligation to continue to put on the costume and go out and perform deeds of heroism, and it's just a very cute movie.
What a delightful premise. Plus, John Ritter, I mean, sort of an icon of the 80s in some ways.
Yeah, more of a TV guy, obviously, remembered more of a TV guy, but he made a few fun movies. So what were your rewindable moments? I already mentioned several of mine.
Well, I'm just not as well versed on 1980. It was very early in my life.
Well, if you don't have any, that's fine.
But I think, we could throw one or two things from Stunt Rock in there, don't you?
How do you pick just
I don't know how you pick just one. I mean, we've mentioned so many things from it that are wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's a scene where Grant Page, the stuntman, goes to ask this journalist who's following him around. It's Brian Trenchard Smith's wife, on a date, and he does some kind of crazy stunt on like a zip line from one building to her like
Yep.
window to ask her out on a
Yeah.
date.
It's crazy.
And there's this wacky like Hollywood party scene that's also kind of funny.
Yeah.
Where everybody in the film is there.
Yeah.
That's kind of fun.
I'm
too.
going to add Aretha Franklin's song Think from Blues Brothers, which is my favorite musical number from a movie full of great musical numbers.
Yes, it's so good.
And the staircase scene in The Shining. I mean, there's a bunch of scenes
there's
got
to be some Shining stuff.
The scene where the blood comes out of the elevator.
Of course.
It's hard to forget. The scene where he goes into the bar and talks to the bar.
I was going to say, I kind of love those
and,
scenes. Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, the staircase scene where he's kind of chasing her up the stairs and she's swinging that bat and he's like, "Windy, love of my life."
Oh,
he's doing that whole
yeah.
monologue.
There's a lot of rewindable moments in The Shining, I think. Yeah. What about Empire? We haven't even talked about Empire. I mean, the Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, what is there to say about it that hasn't been said?
There's not much to
say. It's generally regarded as the best Star Wars movie, which I would agree with. I mean, it probably is. It's the one that introduced Yoda. It's the Hoth planet sequence is incredible. The scene where they hide on the asteroid and it turns out they're inside the guts of the creature that lives in the asteroid.
Right.
I mean, it's just full of delightful,
That's the biggest turning point moment.
Yeah, Luke, you're my son.
Luke, I am your father.
Yeah, it's but I don't know what else there is to say.
Yeah, there's not
it's a
much
masterpiece of science fiction movie making, and
just so as to not anger the Star Wars gods, I thought we ought to point out that, of course, there's rewindable moments in Empire.
All right, I'm just going to blast through really quick some B movies and some sort of so bad it's good movies that I think are worth people's worthwhile.
Yeah.
The Exterminator, which is a ripoff of Death Wish.
Oh.
A particularly nasty one, but if you like those kind of revenge movies, that's a fun one. The Hollywood Nights, which was Tony Danza and Michelle Pfeiffer's first movie.
Oh my God.
Set in the 60s. It's kind of a Grease knockoff. It's kind of fun.
Wow.
The Octagon, which is the first big Hollywood movie with ninjas in it. Actually, that's not true. There was a James Bond movie in the 60s that had ninjas in it. But this was the first movie to kind of like have ninjas in the 80s.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it didn't really launch the ninja craze. That was Enter the Ninja, which came a little later. But the Octagon was also Chuck Norris's kind of first really big Hollywood movie. He fights ninjas in it. But you would think it would be amazing, but it's fun, but it's hampered by the fact that it has this really weird voiceover. They decided to have Chuck whisper all his thoughts in voiceover through the whole movie. So the whole movie, he's walking into a room full of ninjas and you hear him whispering in his head, "I wonder if there are any ninjas in here."
No.
And it doesn't work at all, and it never stops. Saturn III, which is a truly bizarre Kirk Douglas, Farrah Fawcett sci-fi movie.
Whoa.
Windwalker, which is a movie I thought was great when I was a kid, and now I realize is a little corny, but it's a story of, it's a Native American action movie, but all the Native Americans, as it turns out, are played by white actors, which I didn't know when I was young.
Sure,
but I thought it was great when I was a kid, and I still think it's fun. The Watcher in the Woods, which was one of Disney's early attempts at making kind of dark live action PG movies.
Okay.
Betty Davis and Lynn Holly Johnson from Ice Castles. It's a ghost story set in England.
Wow.
The Island, which is the Peter Benchley follow-up to Jaws, which is Michael Caine tangling with modern day pirates that are actually pirates, not like Somali pirates,
swashbuckling
with
pirates.
Parrots and stuff.
Wow,
it's horrible, and by horrible I mean it is a delight.
Yeah. Well, it would have to be.
The Blue Lagoon, of course.
Yes, I saw that on the list.
Where are my Brooke fans at?
Yeah, I love Brooke. I just have never seen that movie. I have to be honest.
It's trashy and dumb and a lot of fun.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
Up the Academy, which I think is Mad Magazine's first movie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is essentially Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown done in live action. It's like Tim Matheson, and it's a raft race.
Oh my.
Down the rapids. And finally, When Time Ran Out, which is an Irwin Allen disaster movie. He was the master of disaster films. This is one of his worst. It's Paul Newman and a bunch of other famous people trying to get away from a volcano as it's blowing up.
Wow. Okay.
And it's boring. But if you look it up online and just watch the last 15 minutes of it, which is this truly bonkers sequence of Paul Newman carrying people over a bridge as it's disintegrating over a river of lava.
Wow.
It's kind of a hoot.
I mean, you're telling all these movies sound like, how did that even happen? I mean, some of the people, Betty Davis and Lynn Holly Johnson in a Disney movie, like what? They just sound incredible.
Well, this is another thing that we know that the 80s did really well that you don't see anymore. Like there just aren't a lot of movies where you're like, how on earth did that get funded and
how did
produced?
It happen?
And how does that exist? How can that be possible?
Yeah.
Like that just doesn't, there's not a lot of movies, modern movies, that you can sort of point to about that, unless you're just saying, that movie's terrible. How does it so bad? But these movies are just like, how did this get past the initial idea?
Someone thought it was a good idea.
Somebody thought this was a good idea.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah. Love it.
All right. Well, I think that'll do it for the first half of 1980. We'll see you in the back half. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Get to watching those films, everyone. See you next time. You've been listening to The Long Rewind. The program is produced by Dustin Morrow and hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli. If you enjoy the show, please consider hitting the subscribe button, leave us a good review on your podcast app, and tell your friends about the program. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.